Stop the truck! The trooper's hand slammed flat against the hood, hard enough that the side mirror shivered. Out. Now, the man behind the wheel didn't move right away. He set both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, the way his mother had taught him before he'd even had a license, and exhaled slow through his nose. License and registration first, or you want me out first? Pick one, officer, because you're asking for both at the same time. Don't get smart with me. The trooper's flashlight came up, blinding even though the sun hadn't fully dropped behind the tree line yet. I said out. He stepped down onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 7, just past Carlton Place, the cold already biting through his flannel shirt. Behind him, his German Shepherd mix, Juno, paced in the back seat, nose pressed to the glass, a low whine building in her throat. Sir, can you tell me the reason for the stop? Tail lights out. Both tail lights are working. I checked them at the gas station 40 minutes ago. The trooper, name tag read R. Dussault, smiled the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. Funny, my eyes tell me different. Two more cruisers rolled up behind, lights washing red and blue across the wet asphalt. A second officer got out, younger, hanging back near her own door, like she wasn't sure yet what kind of stop this was going to be. Dussault waved her forward. Pop the camper shell, he said. We're going to take a look. You have a reason for a search, or is this just because of how I looked driving through your county at 6 in the evening? Dussault's jaw tightened. You want to make this hard, or you want to make this easy? The man, tall, broad through the shoulders, a faded ball cap pushed back on his head, 3 days of stubble, said nothing. He just walked around to the back of the truck, unlatched the camper shell himself, and stepped aside. Dussault climbed up into the bed like he owned it, started hauling out duffel bags, throwing them onto the gravel. A green canvas one split a seam when it hit the ground, and a folded Canadian flag, carefully ironed, corners crisp, spilled half out onto the wet stones. The younger officer crouched down fast and tucked it back, almost apologetic. What's in the case? Dussault was pointing his flashlight at a black, hard-shelled box, bolted into the floor of the truck bed, padlocked. Personal effects. Open it. I don't have to. Then I'll get a tool and open it myself. And that's not going to go well for you, son. There was something in the way he said son, flat, dismissive, like the man standing in front of him in steel-toed boots, and a fading sunburn from a summer of work couldn't possibly be anything other than what Dussault had already decided he was. The man reached into his jacket pocket, slow, both hands visible the whole time, and pulled out a small brass key. He bent down, fitted into the padlock, and let it fall open. Inside, sitting on a bed of gray foam, was a medal. Silver cross, a maple leaf at its center, a deep crimson ribbon folded beside it. Underneath that, a laminated identification card with a photograph and a crest neither officer recognized at first glance, and underneath that, a single folded letter on government letterhead. Dussault's flashlight beam held steady on the medal for 3 full seconds before his face changed. 11 hours before that, Reuben Caplette had been standing in a cold kitchen in Pembroke, Ontario, watching his grandmother fight with a stand mixer that had been older than he was. Nan, let me. I have made this cake 41 years, Reuben Joseph. I do not need help from a boy who burns toast. I haven't burned toast since I was 19. You burned it at Christmas. That was the broiler. That's different. She swatted at him with a wooden spoon, not hard, more habit than anything, and he laughed and backed off, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Outside the window, the maple in the backyard had gone fully red, and a cold front was rolling in off the lake, the kind that meant the first real frost of the season by morning. His grandmother, Odile, was turning 81 in 2 days. She had raised him from the time he was 6, after his mother had died and his father had simply not been able to manage a kid and his own grief at the same time, not in any way that worked. Reuben didn't carry bitterness about that anymore. He'd done the work, over years, to set it down. His father called twice a year now, on his birthday and at Christmas, and that was what it was. Odile had been the one who showed up to every parent-teacher conference, who sat in the bleachers for every hockey game even when the rink was so cold, her breath fogged thicker than the players did, who sewed his name into his gear with her own hands because the embroidery shop charged too much. She'd worked at the cannery for 30 years, on her feet 10 hours a day, and never once let him see how much it hurt by the end of a shift. When he'd told her at 20 that he wanted to join the Canadian Armed Forces, she hadn't cried in front of him. She'd waited until he was at basic training in St. Jean and cried into the phone instead. The kind of crying that was half terror and half a pride she didn't have words for. 16 years later, Reuben was a sergeant in the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. 3 tours. A Star of Military Valour pinned to his chest in a ceremony at Rideau Hall that Odile had attended in her good blue dress, sitting in the front row, clutching a tissue she never used because she refused to let herself cry in public twice in one lifetime. He'd never told most people what he did, not because it was some great secret kept from everyone. Plenty of people in town knew he served, but because he didn't see the point in talking about it. The men he'd served beside knew. That was who needed to know. This week he had 4 days of leave. His commanding officer, Major Whitfield, had practically ordered him to take it. Your grandmother turns 81 once, Caplette. Go home. Eat cake. That's an order. So he'd loaded Juno into the truck. She'd been a rescue from a shelter outside Petawawa, half feral when he got her, calm as a church mouse now. And driven the 6 hours from base, planning to surprise Odile 2 days before her birthday so they'd have real time together, not just a rushed dinner. He stopped twice on the drive. Once for gas, once because Juno needed to stretch her legs at a rest stop outside Renfrew, where an old farmer walked over just to scratch behind her ears and tell Reuben she had good eyes, the kind of dog you could trust. The case in the truck bed, the one with the medal and the ID, he kept there because his apartment on base had been broken into 18 months earlier, nothing taken but the lock busted, and he'd never quite trusted leaving it unattended since. He carried it with him now, the way some men carry a wallet. It went where he went. He had no idea, pulling onto Highway 7 with the late afternoon sun behind him, that in less than 2 hours a small-town traffic stop would turn into the worst 10 minutes of Constable Robert Dussault's career. Dussault had been with the Lanark County Detachment for 6 years. Before that, 4 years in a town 2 hours north that nobody outside the province had heard of. He was, by every official measure, a decent officer. Solid arrest record. No formal complaints on file, not really. 1 or 2 grumbled about incidents that had gone nowhere, the kind that get filed and forgotten. What wasn't on any file, what never showed up in any review, was the particular way his shoulders squared up when he ran a plate and the registered owner's name didn't match what he expected, or when a truck like this one, newer, well-kept, a man like Reuben behind the wheel, passed him on a quiet stretch of road and something in his gut just itched. He would never have called it what it was. He believed, genuinely, that he was a good cop doing his job, keeping the highway safe, trusting his instincts. The trouble was that his instincts had been trained by something he'd never examined, not once, not in 6 years. He'd run the plate before initiating the stop. Registered to R. Caplette, no flags, no warrants, nothing. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it had become the reason. Why's a guy like that driving a truck like this? He hadn't even finished the thought before his lights were already on. His partner that evening, Constable Naomi Strand, 2 years on the job, had asked over the radio if there was a specific infraction. Tail light, Dussault had said. I'll handle it. She'd followed anyway. Something about his voice. Now she stood a few feet back on the gravel shoulder, watching her training officer's flashlight tremble. Actually tremble. Over a medal she didn't recognize and an ID card with a crest that made her stomach drop the second she read the words beneath it. Canadian Special Operations Regiment, Sergeant Reuben Caplette. The letter beneath it, when Dussault's shaking hands finally unfolded it, was from the office of the Governor General. It referenced a citation. It referenced an act of valor during an operation, whose details were redacted in black bars. The kind of redaction that told you everything by telling you nothing. That whatever had happened, it was the sort of thing that earned silence rather than parades. This is. Dussault started and stopped. Reuben hadn't moved. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, watching the trooper's face do the thing he had seen 100 times before, in 100 different uniforms, the recalibration. The sudden, scrambling effort to fit a person into a different box than the one they'd already been shoved into. Sergeant Caplette, Dussault said, and the title came out strange in his mouth, like a language he didn't speak well. We got a call about a vehicle matching this description involved in a... There was a report. There wasn't a report. Naomi's voice cut in, quiet but clear, from behind him. There was no call. I was on dispatch the whole shift. Nothing came through. Dussault turned, and for a second something genuinely ugly moved across his face, not at Reuben, but at her, at being contradicted in front of a civilian. In front of a man who very clearly was not what he'd assumed. Strand, I'm just saying what's true, she said. She didn't back down. Her hands were steady at her sides. There was no call, Bob. You pulled him over because a tail light that's been on this whole time was supposedly out, and then you searched his truck because... She stopped herself, glanced at Reuben, then finished it anyway. Because some things needed saying out loud to mean anything. Because of how it looked, him, driving that truck. That's the whole reason, and we both know it. The silence afterward had weight to it. Even the wind seemed to drop. Reuben crouched down, slow and deliberate, and began gathering his things off the gravel. The folded flag first, brushing grit from its corners, with the same careful motion his grandmother used on her good china. Then the duffel bags, the birthday gifts that had spilled half out of one of them. A sweater in Odile's favorite shade of green. A card he'd handwritten 3 separate times until it sounded the way he wanted it to sound. You don't have to say anything else, he said, not looking up. I'm not interested in an apology that's really just an excuse with better manners. Sir, I have somewhere to be. Reuben stood, the case back in his hand, locked again. My grandmother's turning 81 in 2 days, and I drove 6 hours so I could surprise her early. I'd like to get there before dark. Naomi stepped forward. Sergeant Caplette, I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened. I'll be filing a full report on this stop. And I want you to know your name and badge information for that report, if you're willing to give them. Not to make trouble for you, to make sure there's a record. The kind that actually exists this time. Something in her tone, direct, unflinching, the voice of someone who'd clearly decided in that moment what kind of officer she was going to be for the rest of her career, made Reuben pause. Caplette, he said. Reuben, Sergeant, Canadian Special Operations Regiment, currently stationed out of Garrison Petawawa. He paused, and I appreciate it, genuinely. He didn't look at Dussault again. He loaded the duffel bags back into the bed, latched the camper shell, let Juno out for 2 minutes to stretch her legs and relieve herself in the ditch grass, and got back behind the wheel. In the rearview mirror, as he pulled back onto the highway, he watched Dussault standing alone on the shoulder, still holding the unfolded letter, the flashlight hanging useless and forgotten in his other hand. Naomi didn't let it go. That was the part that mattered, the part that turned one bad stop into something that actually changed anything. She filed her report that same night, before her shift ended, while the details were still sharp in her memory, rather than softened by sleep or talked down by colleagues who'd want her to let it lie. She wrote it factually, without embellishment, because she understood that the facts on their own were damning enough. No probable cause given for the initial stop. No call received corroborating the stated reason for escalation to a vehicle search. A civilian, later identified as a decorated member of the Canadian Armed Forces, detained and searched without consent freely given, his personal property scattered on a public roadway. She included the badge numbers. She included the timestamp from dispatch logs that proved no call had come through. She included her own observations, plainly, without softening them to protect a man she'd worked 16-hour shifts beside for 2 years. It would have been easier to say nothing. She knew that. Dussault was well liked at the detachment, the kind of guy who brought donuts on Fridays and remembered everyone's kids' names. Filing this meant a fracture in that, possibly a permanent one. It meant some of her colleagues would look at her differently for a while, maybe a long while. She filed it anyway, because the alternative was looking at herself in a mirror every morning and knowing what she'd let pass without a word. The detachment staff sergeant called her in 2 days later. The investigation moved faster than these things usually did, mostly because the dispatch logs left no ambiguity to argue around. Dussault was placed on administrative leave pending review. Whether that review would end in a transfer, a formal reprimand, a forced retirement, or something more serious, nobody could say yet. These processes ground slow, the way any institution's internal accounting tends to. But the file existed now. The pattern, once one person was brave enough to write the first true account of it down, had somewhere to go. Reuben never asked for any of that to happen. He hadn't filed a complaint himself, hadn't called a lawyer, hadn't done anything except give his name when asked by someone who actually wanted to hear it. He drove home, walked into his grandmother's house 2 days before her birthday, with a duffel bag of gifts and a dog who immediately tracked mud across her clean kitchen floor, and let Odile fuss and cry and swat him with the same wooden spoon she'd been swatting him with his whole life. He didn't tell her about the stop. Not that night, not the next day either. It wasn't that he was hiding it, it just didn't seem like the kind of thing worth bringing into a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and browning butter, into a house where his grandmother was turning 81 and wanted, more than anything, just to have her grandson home and fed and within arm's reach for a few days. He told her, eventually, 3 weeks later, over the phone, after Naomi had called to update him on the investigation's progress, and he felt like Odile deserved to hear it from him, rather than stumble onto it some other way. Odile was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "That girl," she said finally. "The young one. Naomi, what about her? She did a hard thing. Tell her, if you ever see her again, that an old woman from Pembroke thinks she's the kind of police officer this country needs more of." A pause. "And tell her I'll send her some of my tourtière. Everyone deserves a little reward for doing the right thing when it costs them something." Reuben laughed, the real kind, the kind that came up from somewhere low in his chest. "I'll let her know, Nan." "And the other one, the man, Dussault. Don't you waste one more breath on him, Reuben Joseph. Some people only learn when the floor finally gives out from under them. That's not your job to teach. You already gave him the only lesson that mattered, just by standing there and being exactly who you've always been." He sat with that for a long while after they hung up, looking out at the dark fields behind his apartment on base, Juno's head heavy and warm against his knee. He thought about all the years before this one. The years where nobody had known his name, where he'd been just a man in a truck, just a face that fit a story somebody else had already decided to tell about him before he'd said a single word. He thought about how close that story had come to being the only one that mattered if Naomi Strand hadn't decided, in one cold moment on a gravel shoulder, that the truth was worth more to her than her own comfort. It wasn't really about the medal. He understood that clearly now, turning it over in his mind the way he might turn the medal itself over in his palm. The medal hadn't made him worth respect. He'd always been worth that, long before any ceremony, long before any citation with half its words blacked out. The medal had only made it impossible, for one evening, for somebody to pretend otherwise. That was the part that stayed with him longest, driving back to base. A few days later, Juno asleep across the back seat. The highway unspooling gray and quiet under an early winter sky. Not the moment Dussault's flashlight had trembled over the silver cross. Not even the relief of watching him stumble through an apology that came too late to be one. It was the sound of Naomi Strand's voice, steady against the wind, saying the true thing out loud when it would have been so much easier to say nothing at all. That, he thought, watching the road empty out ahead of him toward home, was the only thing in this whole country worth saluting.